You are being controlled right now, not by a person, not by a system you can see, by a set of mechanisms so deeply embedded in the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you make decisions that you have never experienced a moment without them. You call their outputs your opinions. You call their products your preferences. You call their conclusions your choices. And none of those things are as freely yours as you believe. This is not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination and secrecy. What is controlling you requires neither. It operates through the ordinary architecture of human psychology, through the same cognitive structures that allowed our ancestors to survive in tribal environments, repurposed and amplified by modern institutions, media systems, and social environments that have learned, with extraordinary precision, exactly which levers to pull to produce exactly which behaviors. The control is not hidden because it needs to be. It is hidden because the mechanism of control is invisible to the person being controlled by design. The Stoics identified the root of this problem more than 2,000 years ago. Epictetus wrote that men are disturbed not by things, but by the opinions they hold about things. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. These were not philosophical consolations. They were operational warnings. A man who does not understand the mechanism by which his opinions are formed, by which his emotional responses are triggered, and by which his decisions are shaped before he believes he has made them, is not a free man. He is a man who believes he is free, which is a different and considerably more expensive condition. What follows is a precise map of 7 mechanisms by which the 99% are controlled without knowing it. Each mechanism is real, documented, and operating in your life right now. Each one has a specific Stoic counter mechanism that has been confirmed by modern psychology. And each one, once seen clearly, loses most of its power. Because the primary weapon of every mechanism of invisible control is its invisibility. The moment you can name it, you are already partially free of it. Dr. Robert Cialdini at Arizona State University spent decades mapping what he called the automatic compliance mechanisms embedded in human social psychology. His research demonstrated that the vast majority of human decisions are not the product of deliberate reasoning. They are the product of deeply wired shortcuts, heuristics that the brain uses to navigate complex social environments without spending the cognitive resources that genuine deliberation would require. These shortcuts are not flaws. They are features. In most contexts, they produce good enough decisions fast enough to be adaptive. The problem arises when these shortcuts are identified, isolated, and deliberately triggered by people and systems that understand them better than you do. The man who understands these mechanisms is not immune to them. The brain runs the shortcuts regardless of whether the conscious mind knows about them. But understanding them creates a gap between the trigger and the response, the space that Viktor Frankl described as the location of human freedom. In that gap, deliberate choice becomes possible. And deliberate choice, exercised consistently, is the Stoic definition of a free man. Mechanism 1. Social proof. You are constantly looking to others to determine what is true, what is desirable, and what is acceptable. And you almost never know you are doing it. Dr. Solomon Asch at Swarthmore College conducted a series of experiments in the 1950s that produced one of the most uncomfortable findings in the history of psychology. He showed participants a line of a specific length and asked them to identify which of 3 comparison lines matched it. The correct answer was obvious. When participants answered alone, they were accurate almost universally. When they answered in a group, where the other members, who were confederates of the researcher, unanimously chose the wrong answer. Approximately 75% of participants gave the wrong answer at least once. Not because they could not see the correct answer, because the unanimous social signal overrode their own perception. Asch's research documented something that has been confirmed in hundreds of subsequent studies across cultures and domains. The human brain does not treat social consensus as one source of information among many. It treats social consensus as evidence that overrides individual perception when the two conflict. This made perfect evolutionary sense in a tribal environment, where the collective knowledge of the group was almost always more reliable than individual assessment. It makes considerably less sense in a modern environment, where social consensus can be manufactured, purchased, and deployed at scale by anyone with sufficient resources and sufficient understanding of the mechanism. You see this operating in every domain of your life. The restaurant with the line outside that you assume is better than the empty one next door. The book that became a bestseller that you assume is more valuable than the equally good book that did not. The opinion that everyone in your professional environment holds that you assume must have some basis in reality, even when you cannot identify what that basis is. The investment that everyone is talking about that you assume is worth investigating. In each case, the social signal is doing the work that your own analysis should be doing. And the social signal can be wrong, manufactured, or deliberately misleading, with an ease that your individual analysis could detect if it were given the chance to operate. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this with precision in his journals. He described the practice of asking himself, before accepting any widely held opinion, what evidence he personally had for it, beyond the fact that it was widely held. This single question, applied consistently, is the Stoic counter to social proof. Not contrarianism. Not the reflexive rejection of consensus. The deliberate practice of asking what you actually know versus what you are accepting because others seem to accept it. The man who applies this question to his political opinions, his professional beliefs, his social values, and his personal preferences will find that a significant portion of what he considers his own views were never examined by him at all. They were inherited from the consensus of the environments he passed through. Dr. Wendy Wood at the University of Southern California conducted research on what she called the social origins of habit, demonstrating that approximately 43% of human behavior on any given day is habitual, performed in the same physical and social context as previous performances of the same behavior. The implication is significant. Nearly half of what you do each day was not chosen in the moment. It was inherited from the social environment in which the habit formed. Change the environment and the behavior changes automatically. Maintain the environment and the behavior is maintained automatically, regardless of the intentions, goals, or self-image of the person performing it. Dr. Chip Heath at Stanford Graduate School of Business and Dr. Dan Heath studied what they called the curse of knowledge in their research on decision-making. The finding that people with extensive knowledge of a domain systematically overestimate how much of that knowledge is shared by others. The reverse effect operates with equal power in social environments. people systematically underestimate how much of what they believe was acquired through social transmission rather than through independent reasoning. The man who believes his political views are the product of careful analysis, and the man who believes his investment philosophy is the product of independent research, and the man who believes his professional opinions are the product of direct experience are, in most cases, significantly overestimating the independence of those views from the social environments in which they formed. The counter mechanism is deliberate exposure audit. Examine the 3 primary social environments in which you spend your time. What are the dominant opinions? What are the dominant behaviors? What is considered normal? Then ask how many of your own opinions, behaviors, and definitions of normal match those environments precisely. The overlap will be higher than you expect, and the overlap that cannot be explained by independent reasoning is the overlap that belongs to the mechanism rather than to you. Mechanism 2. Scarcity and urgency. Your brain treats rarity as value and time pressure as necessity. Both can be manufactured. Dr. Robert Cialdini documented the scarcity principle as one of the 6 primary compliance mechanisms in his research on influence. The finding was consistent across every domain studied. When something is presented as rare, limited, or disappearing, people assign it higher value regardless of its actual worth. When a deadline is attached to a decision, the quality of that decision degrades in proportion to the perceived urgency. Both effects are automatic, unconscious, and extremely difficult to override in the moment they are operating. The evolutionary basis for scarcity response is clear. In an environment of genuine resource scarcity, the ability to recognize and act on rare opportunities was survival behavior. The man who hesitated when food was available when food was scarce did not survive to pass on his hesitation. The urgency response is equally ancient. In an environment where threats were physical and immediate, the ability to respond to time pressure without deliberation was equally adaptive. The brain that stopped to analyze the urgency of an approaching predator did not survive long enough to become your ancestor. In a modern environment, both of these mechanisms are routinely exploited. The limited time offer that is never actually limited. The exclusive opportunity that is offered to everyone on the mailing list. The urgent situation that requires your immediate decision before you have had time to consult anyone, research anything, or sleep on it. The investment that must be made today, because tomorrow the opportunity will be gone. Each of these triggers the same neurological response as genuine scarcity and genuine urgency. The brain does not distinguish between manufactured pressure and real pressure. It responds to the signal regardless of the source. Seneca wrote On the Shortness of Life that the man who allows urgency to be imposed on him has surrendered the one resource that cannot be recovered. Time that is spent in response to manufactured urgency is time that was never freely given. It was taken, and the mechanism by which it was taken was a hijacking of a cognitive system that was designed for a completely different environment than the one in which it is being exploited. The Stoic counter-mechanism is the deliberate pause before any decision made under time pressure. Specifically, the practice of identifying the source of the urgency before acting on it. Is this urgency coming from the nature of the situation or from the presentation of the situation by someone who benefits from your rapid decision? If the urgency is being applied by another party, it is almost always manufactured. Real urgency does not require announcement. It is self-evident. A building that is actually on fire does not need a salesman telling you that you only have the next 60 seconds to decide whether to leave. Dr. Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia conducted research on what he called the introspection illusion, the consistent finding that people are poor judges of why they made the decisions they made. When asked to explain their choices, people construct post hoc narratives that feel accurate, but frequently bear little relationship to the actual drivers of the decision. The scarcity and urgency triggers operate below the level of the introspection that produces these narratives. The man who buys the limited edition because he was afraid of missing out does not report that he was afraid of missing out. He reports that he assessed the value and decided it was worth the price. The mechanism was invisible, the narrative was confabulated, and the money was spent. The most dangerous application of manufactured urgency in the modern environment is not in consumer sales, where it is at least occasionally visible. It is in the domain of information consumption. Breaking news, by definition, is presented as urgent. It demands immediate attention and immediate emotional response. The brain's urgency processing treats it as such. And the decisions made in response to that urgency, the political opinions formed, the fears activated, the alliances constructed, are made in a state of cognitive compression that systematically produces worse judgment than the same decisions made without the urgency signal. The news is not just information. It is information delivered with a timing and urgency structure designed to trigger specific cognitive and emotional states. Understanding this does not mean ignoring information. It means developing the discipline of delayed processing, consuming information without immediately forming conclusions about it, allowing the urgency signal to dissipate before the reasoning begins. Mechanism 3, authority bias. You assign credibility based on signals of status rather than evidence of expertise. And those signals are often designed to be assigned. Dr. Stanley Milgram at Yale University conducted the most famous and disturbing demonstration of authority bias in the history of psychology. In his obedience experiments of the 1960s, ordinary people administered what they believed were severe electric shocks to screaming strangers, simply because a man in a white lab coat told them to continue. 65% of participants administered what they believed was the maximum shock level, not because they were cruel, because the authority signal of the white coat and the institutional setting overrode their own moral judgment in the moment. Before moving to those triggers, one dimension of the Milgram findings deserves specific attention. The participants who administered the shocks were not, by any psychological assessment, unusually obedient or unusually cruel. They were ordinary people producing extraordinary compliance because the authority signal was strong and the social situation made non-compliance feel like the deviant choice rather than the rational one. This is the essential insight. The mechanism does not require weak or unusual people. It requires the right triggers in the right context. And the right triggers are present in almost every significant domain of modern life. The Milgram findings have been replicated across cultures, across decades, and across contexts, far removed from the laboratory. The specific triggers of authority compliance are well documented. Titles, uniforms, institutional affiliations, confident delivery, physical height, expensive clothing, specific professional vocabulary, None of these signals guarantee competence or integrity. All of them trigger the authority heuristic, the brain's shortcut for deciding whose instructions to follow without independently verifying the basis for those instructions. In the modern environment, authority signals are produced and deployed at industrial scale. The financial advisor with the impressive office and the framed credentials making recommendations based on the products that generate the highest commission. The expert commentator whose authority signal is their frequency of television appearances rather than the accuracy of their predictions. The influencer whose perceived authority is based on follower count, which is itself a social proof mechanism layered on top of the authority mechanism. The executive whose positional authority is used to override the better judgment of people below them in the hierarchy who actually understand the problem. Marcus Aurelius, who had more legitimate authority than almost any human in history, wrote extensively in his journals about the practice of evaluating arguments on their merits rather than on the status of the person making them. He recorded disagreements with senators, generals, and philosophers, where his conclusion was that the high-status person was wrong and the lower-status person was correct. He did not record this as an exercise in humility. He recorded it as a discipline of clear thinking. The authority of the speaker is information about their social position. It is not information about the accuracy of their claims. The Stoic counter-mechanism is the practice of separating the argument from the arguer. When you find yourself inclined to accept a claim, stop and ask what evidence supports it independently of who is making it. What would you think of this claim if it were made by someone with no authority signals at all? If the answer is that you would not accept it, the authority signal is doing the work that evidence should be doing. And a decision based on authority signals rather than evidence is a decision that belongs to the mechanism, not to you. Mechanism 4. Loss aversion. You are twice as motivated by the prospect of losing something as by the prospect of gaining something of equal value. This asymmetry is exploited in almost every significant decision you make. Dr. Daniel Kahneman and Dr. Amos Tversky at Hebrew University documented loss aversion in their foundational research on prospect theory, for which Kahneman received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. Their finding was precise. The psychological pain of losing $100 is approximately twice the psychological pleasure of gaining $100. The brain does not treat gains and losses symmetrically. It treats losses as emergencies and gains as normal. And this asymmetry distorts decision-making in ways that are consistent, predictable, and deeply exploitable. Loss aversion explains why people stay in jobs, relationships, and situations that are producing no value for them. The potential loss of what they have, however inadequate, outweighs the potential gain of something better, however superior, in their psychological accounting. It explains why people refuse to cut losses on investments that have already failed, because selling at a loss makes the loss real, while holding maintains the fiction that the situation might reverse. It explains why the framing of a decision as avoiding a loss consistently produces more compliance than framing the same decision as achieving a gain, even when the two frames describe identical outcomes. Epictetus addressed the root of loss aversion with characteristic directness. He taught that attachment to things outside your control is the source of all suffering, not because the things are not valuable, because the fear of losing them consumes a quality of attention and energy that no possession is worth. The man who is afraid of losing what he has cannot fully use what he has. He is spending his present managing the fear of a future that has not arrived and may never arrive, at the cost of the present that is actually available to him. Dr. Richard Thaler at the University of Chicago, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017 for his work on behavioral economics, documented the endowment effect as a direct consequence of loss aversion. His research showed that people value objects they own significantly more than identical objects they do not own, simply because ownership creates the psychological framing of potential loss. In one famous experiment, participants randomly given coffee mugs demanded significantly more money to sell them than other participants were willing to pay to buy identical mugs. The mugs were the same. The psychological ownership was different. And that psychological ownership, by triggering loss aversion, created a gap between buying price and selling price that had nothing to do with the actual value of the mugs. The endowment effect operates in every domain where ownership is possible, including ownership of opinions, positions, and identities, which are the most expensive things most men are holding, far past the point of their actual value. The Stoic practice of negative visualization is the counter-mechanism to loss aversion. By deliberately imagining the loss of valued things in the mind before they are actually lost, the Stoic practitioner accomplishes two things simultaneously. He reduces the emotional power that the fear of loss has over his present behavior, and he increases the appreciation he has for the things he currently has, which is itself a form of freedom. The man who has already imagined life without his health, his relationships, his resources, and his status is not managed by the fear of losing any of them. He has processed that fear in a context where it costs him nothing except the quality of his attention for a few deliberate minutes. And having processed it, he can make decisions about his present life based on what actually serves his values, rather than on what minimizes his exposure to imagined future losses. Mechanism 5, the Availability Heuristic. What you can easily remember feels more likely, more important, and more representative than it actually is. Dr. Amos Tversky and Dr. Daniel Kahneman identified the Availability Heuristic as one of the primary shortcuts the brain uses to estimate probability and importance. The finding was counterintuitive and significant. People do not estimate the likelihood of events by analyzing base rates, statistical frequencies, or systematic evidence. They estimate likelihood by how easily examples come to mind. The easier it is to remember an instance of something, the more likely the brain judges that something to be. And the ease with which something comes to mind is determined not by its actual frequency, but by its recency, its emotional impact, and its vividness. All three of these factors are directly manipulable by anyone with access to a media channel. The consequences of this mechanism are visible in every domain where public opinion shapes behavior. The crime that receives extensive media coverage becomes the crime that people perceive as most common, regardless of its actual frequency. The economic catastrophe that is described in vivid detail becomes the scenario that investors prepare for most extensively, regardless of its actual probability relative to other risks. The rare but dramatic medical condition that generates significant news coverage becomes the condition that people most fear, while the common conditions that kill far more people each year receive less attention because they are less vivid. In a pre-media environment, the availability heuristic was reasonably accurate. If something came easily to mind, it was likely because you had encountered it frequently in your direct experience. Your direct experience was a reasonable sample of your actual environment. In a media environment, what comes easily to mind is determined by editorial decisions, algorithmic amplification, and the economic incentives of platforms that profit from emotional engagement. What is available to your memory is not a sample of reality. It is a curated selection optimized for engagement, not for accuracy. Marcus Aurelius practiced what he called returning to the facts, the deliberate exercise of stripping away the emotional and narrative overlay from a situation to examine what was actually, verifiably true. When faced with a decision that involved estimating risk or probability, he recorded the practice of asking what he actually knew versus what he was assuming based on recent vivid examples. This practice did not always produce different conclusions, but it consistently produced conclusions that were made by the man rather than by the mechanism. The specific distortion this produces in political and social reasoning is worth naming precisely. The man who consumes media that repeatedly presents vivid examples of a specific type of threat, a specific type of person, a specific type of failure, will gradually develop a perception of the world in which that threat, that person, and that type of failure are more common, more dangerous, and more representative of reality than the actual data supports. His fear response will be calibrated to the media environment rather than to the actual environment. His political opinions will be shaped by which vivid examples he has been exposed to, rather than by what the systematic evidence shows. And his decisions about where to live, what to do, whom to trust, and what to avoid will be made based on a map of the world that was drawn by editorial decisions and algorithmic amplification, rather than by his own direct experience and careful analysis. The counter mechanism is to deliberately seek base rates before making any significant judgment about probability or importance. How often does this actually happen? What is the actual statistical frequency of this outcome? What does the systematic evidence show, independent of the most memorable examples? These questions do not always change the conclusion, but they ensure that the conclusion is based on information rather than on the availability heuristic that is selecting which information feels most real. Mechanism 6. Commitment and consistency. Once you have taken a position, your brain will protect that position, regardless of the evidence that contradicts it. Dr. Robert Cialdini documented what he called the commitment and consistency principle as one of the most powerful and most exploited of the automatic compliance mechanisms. The finding was precise. Once a person has committed to a position, a belief, or a course of action, the psychological drive to remain consistent with that commitment becomes a primary driver of subsequent behavior. This drive is stronger than logic, stronger than new evidence, stronger than the considered judgment of trusted advisors. The commitment was made. The brain will protect it. Dr. Carol Tavris at Claremont Graduate University and Dr. Elliot Aronson at Stanford spent decades studying what they called the pyramid of choice, the process by which small initial commitments generate escalating justifications that pull the person further and further from an honest assessment of their position. Their research showed that two people who start with nearly identical views and make one small decision in different directions will, over time, end up in dramatically different places, each one having constructed an increasingly elaborate justification for the direction their initial choice implied. The initial decision was small. The commitment to consistency made it larger and larger, until the position was extreme, and the distance from an honest re-examination felt enormous. This is how reasonable men end up in unreasonable places, not through dramatic conversion, through small commitments that the consistency drive protected until protection became the primary activity. The evolutionary basis is clear. In a social environment where reputation mattered for survival, the man who changed his position frequently was unreliable. Unreliable men were not given resources, partnerships, or trust. Consistency was a social signal of integrity. The brain developed a strong drive to maintain consistency, not because consistency was always correct, but because the social costs of inconsistency were severe. In a modern environment, where changing your mind in response to new evidence is the definition of good reasoning rather than a social liability, this drive produces the opposite of its intended effect. It keeps men committed to positions, investments, and identities that no longer serve them long after the evidence has indicated that change is warranted. You see this in the investor who refuses to acknowledge that an investment has failed because acknowledging the failure would require admitting that the original decision was wrong. You see it in the professional who continues pursuing a career path that has stopped serving him because changing direction would require revising the identity he has built around being the kind of man who does not change direction. You see it in the political beliefs that have not been genuinely re-examined in 20 years, because examining them might produce conclusions that conflict with the identity built around holding them. In each case, the commitment is protecting itself at the expense of the man who made it. Epictetus taught that the willingness to revise your judgment in response to better information was not weakness. It was the definition of good judgment. He wrote that the philosopher is the man who says, "Show me the better argument, and I will change my view," because only the man who does not know what he is doing clings to positions for reasons of pride. Marcus Aurelius recorded numerous instances in his journals of changing his assessment of a situation, a person, or a decision in response to new information. He did not record these as failures. He recorded them as successful applications of the practice of clear thinking. The Stoic counter-mechanism is what modern psychologists call motivated skepticism applied to your own positions. The practice of periodically asking, "What would change my mind about this?" If you cannot identify any evidence that would change your position on something you hold strongly, your commitment to the position has become independent of the evidence. It is now being maintained by the consistency drive rather than by the reasoning that originally produced it. That is the signal that the mechanism has taken over, and the mechanism does not serve you. It serves its own perpetuation. Mechanism 7. Identity capture. The most powerful form of control is the one that makes you want to do what you are being controlled to do, because you have been made to believe that doing it is who you are. This is the deepest and most consequential of the 7 mechanisms. Every other mechanism operates on your behavior from the outside. This one operates from the inside. It works by attaching a behavior, a belief, or an allegiance to your sense of self. Once that attachment is made, the behavior is not something you do. It is something you are. And the man who believes that a behavior or belief is part of his identity will defend it, maintain it, and feel threatened by challenges to it with an intensity that has nothing to do with the actual importance of the behavior or belief, because the threat is not to the behavior, it is to the self. Dr. Henri Tajfel at the University of Bristol developed social identity theory in the 1970s through research that documented the extraordinary ease with which people develop deep loyalty to arbitrary group memberships. His experiments showed that participants randomly assigned to groups and given trivial distinguishing characteristics within minutes began systematically favoring their own group members and discriminating against members of the other group, not based on any meaningful difference, based purely on the group membership itself. The identity attachment was instantaneous. The behavioral consequences were immediate and significant. What Tajfel's research demonstrated about the speed and ease of identity formation has been confirmed and extended by decades of subsequent research. Dr. Jonathan Haidt at New York University, in his research on moral psychology, documented what he called the tribal moral community, the finding that humans naturally organize moral reasoning around group membership rather than around universal principles. His research showed that people do not first reason to moral conclusions and then find communities that share those conclusions. They first find communities and then adopt the moral conclusions that the community holds, with the reasoning constructed afterward as justification. The identity precedes the belief, the group precedes the principle, and the man who is unaware of this sequence in his own development has no way of knowing which of his most deeply held convictions are the product of his own examination, and which are the product of the community that formed him. In a modern environment, identity attachment is manufactured and deployed at industrial scale. Political identities that come pre-packaged with hundreds of specific beliefs on unrelated topics, so that accepting the identity means accepting all of the beliefs simultaneously without examining any of them individually. Consumer identities that define who you are through what you buy, so that the brand becomes a signal of character and purchasing becomes self-expression. Professional identities that come with social norms about acceptable opinions, so that holding unacceptable opinions puts the professional identity at risk. Religious identities, national identities, class identities, all of them functioning as pre-packaged belief systems that the brain adopts as self-defining, because the social benefits of group membership are real and the cognitive costs of individual examination are significant. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this with a directness that is almost jarring in its modernity. He wrote that he was a man first, a Roman second, an emperor third. He was describing the practice of maintaining a hierarchy of identity that placed the universal human identity above the specific social identities that come with pre-packaged behavioral requirements. This was not anti-Roman or anti-imperial. It was the recognition that his most reliable guide to right action was the part of his identity that was not attached to any particular group, the part that could examine any question without the distortion produced by identity-protective reasoning. Dr. Nir Eyal at Stanford University, in his research on habit formation and what he called the hooked model, documented precisely how modern products and platforms are designed to create identity attachment that makes continued use feel like self-expression rather than compliance. The platform is not selling you a service. It is selling you a version of yourself. And once you have accepted that version, the behavior of using the platform is no longer something you choose. It is something you do because it is who you are. The control is complete and invisible because it has become indistinguishable from identity. The Stoic counter-mechanism is what Epictetus called the practice of philosophical identity, the deliberate placement of your deepest identity not in any social role, group membership, or behavioral pattern, but in your capacity to reason clearly and act according to your own examined values. Not the values you inherited, not the values your group expects, the values you have examined, tested, and chosen to hold, because examination produced the conclusion that they were worth holding. This identity cannot be captured because it is defined by the practice of not being captured. The man whose deepest identity is the practice of clear thinking is immune to identity capture because there is no fixed position that can be threatened, no group membership that can be weaponized, no belief package that can be sold. He is, in the Stoic sense, free. Before the applications, one observation about the relationship between these 7 mechanisms deserves specific attention. They are not parallel and independent. They form a hierarchy with identity capture at the top. Social proof shapes what you believe is normal. Scarcity and urgency shape when and how you decide. Authority bias shapes whose instructions you follow. Loss aversion shapes what you protect and what you sacrifice. The availability heuristic shapes what risks feel real. Commitment and consistency shape how you defend what you have already done. And identity capture provides the overarching framework that makes all of these other mechanisms feel like the expression of who you are, rather than the operation of cognitive shortcuts that are being exploited. The man who addresses only the surface mechanisms while leaving the identity layer intact will find that the work is never done. Because every time he frees himself from one instance of social proof or one instance of manufactured urgency, the identity that was shaped by these mechanisms will generate new instances. The root is identity. The branches are the other 6 mechanisms. Pruning the branches without addressing the root produces a temporarily cleaner tree that grows back in the same shape. This is why the Stoic philosophical tradition placed such emphasis on what Epictetus called the work of philosophy, the continuous, deliberate examination of what you believe and why you believe it, what you value and why you value it, who you are, and how you came to be that person. Not as an intellectual exercise, as a practical discipline of liberation. The man who knows how his beliefs were formed can choose which ones to keep. The man who does not know has no choice at all, because he does not know that a choice is available. Marcus Aurelius conducted this examination every day of his adult life in the privacy of his journals. He did not conduct it because he had resolved all the questions. He conducted it because he understood that the moment the examination stopped, the mechanisms would fill the space it left. The examination was not a project with a completion date. It was a daily practice of maintenance against the continuous operation of the mechanisms. And the authority it produced, in himself and in the room, was the authority of a man who was actually thinking, rather than a man who was being thought by the systems designed to think for him. Here is what you do with the 7 mechanisms starting today. The first action is to identify one opinion you hold that you have never examined independently, not the opinion you disagree with most strongly, the one you agree with most automatically, the one that feels most obvious, the one that everyone in your primary environment seems to hold. That opinion is the most likely candidate for social proof capture. Examine it. Ask what evidence you personally have for it. Ask what you would conclude if you encountered the same evidence without the social consensus pointing you toward the expected conclusion. The second action is to implement a mandatory waiting period for any decision made under time pressure this week. Before acting on any urgency signal, ask one question: who benefits from my deciding quickly? If the answer is the person or system presenting the urgency is manufactured. Take the time you need. If the opportunity disappears because you took the time to think, it was not the opportunity it was presented as. The third action is to evaluate one authority claim this week on the basis of evidence rather than on the basis of the authority signal. Find one situation where you are inclined to accept something because of who said it rather than because of what they said. Strip out the who. Examine only the what. Ask what evidence supports the claim independently of the person making it. Notice how often the evidence is thinner than the authority signal suggested it would be. The fourth action is to apply negative visualization to one significant fear of loss this week. Choose the thing you are most afraid of losing. Spend 10 minutes genuinely imagining life after that loss, not catastrophizing, imagining, asking what would actually remain, what you would do, what would still be possible. Most men find that the imagined loss, when examined honestly, is survivable in ways they had not previously allowed themselves to consider. And a loss that has been imagined is a loss that can no longer be used to control the present. The fifth action is to seek the base rate for one risk or probability you are currently managing through vivid memory. Identify one fear or concern that is occupying significant mental space. Then find the actual statistical frequency of the outcome you fear. How often does this actually happen to people in your situation? What does the evidence show when it is examined systematically rather than through the lens of memorable examples? Allow the base rate to compete with the availability heuristic. The base rate will not always win, but given it the opportunity to compete is the beginning of clearer risk assessment. The sixth action is to identify one position you hold that you have not genuinely questioned in more than 2 years. Not to abandon it, to examine it. Ask what evidence would change your mind about this. Ask whether you have actively sought that evidence or whether you have been exposed only to information that confirms the position. The man who cannot identify any evidence that would change his mind is not holding a position. He's being held by one. The seventh action is to map your identity attachments. Write down the groups you belong to, the roles you inhabit, the labels you accept as self-defining. Then ask for each one. What behaviors and beliefs does this identity require of me that I have never independently examined? What would I lose, socially, professionally, or relationally, if I publicly deviated from those requirements? The answers to those questions are the precise locations of your identity capture, not to be abandoned, to be seen. Because seeing them is the beginning of owning them rather than being owned by them. There is one final point about the nature of this work that deserves to be stated directly. Learning about these mechanisms does not make you immune to them. The research on this question is consistent. Even people who study cognitive biases professionally are subject to those biases in their own thinking. Even psychologists who study loss aversion make decisions driven by loss aversion. Even researchers who study authority bias are influenced by authority signals. Knowledge of the mechanism does not deactivate it. What knowledge does is create the possibility of catching the mechanism in operation in real time, often enough and consistently enough to redirect the response before it becomes action. That is the realistic goal, not immunity. Increased frequency of intervention. And increased frequency of intervention, sustained over months and years, produces a meaningfully different quality of decision-making than the alternative. Not perfect decision-making, better decision-making, made by the man rather than by the mechanism, which is the definition of what it means to be in control of your own life. The 99% are not controlled because they are weak or stupid or uninformed. They are controlled because the mechanisms that control them are designed specifically for brains like theirs, for the cognitive architecture that every human being carries. The man who is different is not the man who has a different brain. He is the man who has learned to see the mechanisms operating in his brain and has developed the deliberate practice of inserting choice into the gap between the trigger and the response. Frankl developed this insight not in a library, but in the Auschwitz concentration camp, in conditions specifically designed to eliminate all human freedom and reduce people to pure behavioral response to external control. His observation that even in those conditions, the last freedom, the freedom to choose your response to what was happening, remained available, was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a report from the most extreme test of the proposition that human beings can maintain interiority in the face of total external control. If the gap between stimulus and response was available there, it is available everywhere. The mechanisms that control the 99% are powerful. They are not Auschwitz. The gap is always there. The question is only whether you know it is there, and whether you have developed the practice of using it. Dr. Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada developed acceptance and commitment therapy in part from Frankl's insights, creating what he called psychological flexibility, the capacity to be in contact with the present moment fully as a conscious human being, and to change or persist in behavior when doing so serves valued ends. His research documented that psychological flexibility, trained through specific practices over time, measurably reduces the automatic operation of every cognitive mechanism discussed here. Not by eliminating the mechanisms, by inserting the observing awareness that creates the gap. The trained observer sees the social proof operating and notes it without being captured by it, sees the urgency signal and notes it without acting on it, sees the authority trigger and notes it without complying automatically. The mechanisms run, the observer watches them run, and in the watching, the choice becomes available. That gap is what Viktor Frankl called the last of human freedoms. The freedom to choose your response to any stimulus regardless of the stimulus. The Stoics called it the ruling faculty, the Hegemonikon, the part of the mind that can observe its own operations and choose which ones to act on. Modern neuroscience calls it the prefrontal cortex and documents its capacity to override automatic responses when it is trained to do so. Different names, the same gap, the same freedom, and the same implication. The gap is trainable. It is not a fixed quantity determined by personality or genetics. It is a capacity that grows with practice and atrophies without it. The man who practices inserting deliberate choice into the space between stimulus and response develops a wider gap over time. The man who never practices finds the gap narrowing until the response follows the stimulus with the speed and inevitability of a reflex. The width of the gap is the measure of freedom. And freedom, in the Stoic sense, is not a condition of the external world. It is a condition of the trained mind. Different names, the same gap, the same freedom, the same practice of choosing, deliberately and consistently, not to be what the mechanism wants to make you. That practice, sustained over time, is the difference between the 1% and the 99%. Not talent, not resources, not circumstances. The deliberate daily decision to see the mechanism and to choose something the mechanism did not produce. The next video is already loaded. It covers the psychology of silence, why less is always more, and the specific mechanisms by which the man who speaks less controls more of every room he enters. Watch it now.